There is a sound my phone used to make that I have never quite been able to hear the same way since, a soft double chime, the one reserved for banking alerts, and for almost 9 years, whenever I heard it, my hand moved before my mind did. I didn't check who it was from. I didn't check the amount. I simply approved it, the way you'd catch a glass before it hit the floor, out of reflex rather than thought. That reflex is most of this story, if you want it in a single sentence. For 9 years, I let my daughter's need decide what happened to my money before I ever let myself ask why. I don't regret loving her. I regret how long it took me to understand that those were two different things. My name is Frances Doyle. Everyone has called me Fran since I was small, except my mother, who called me Frances right up until the day she died, as if the shorter version was a liberty she'd never quite forgiven the world for taking. I'm 63 now, a retired schoolteacher, 31 years in the same elementary building 2 towns over from where I still live, in the house I raised my 2 children in. I should tell you about both of them, though this story mostly belongs to one. I want to say plainly, before anything else, that I am telling this in order, because the order is the only way any of it makes sense, and because I have never told it all the way through to another person before tonight. My son, Peter, is 41, married, steady, a structural engineer who calls on Sundays and needs almost nothing from me beyond conversation. My daughter, Nadia, is 36. She is sharp and funny and was, as a child, the kind of furious, brilliant, easily wounded little girl who made you love her a little harder for how much the world seemed determined to bruise her. Her father left when she was 9, not dramatically, just quietly, the way some men manage to disappear without ever technically doing anything wrong, and I have carried, for 27 years now, a very specific guilt about what that departure did to her, a guilt that I now understand shaped nearly every decision I made about money for the rest of both our lives. It started small, the way these things do. Nadia was 24, freshly out of a graduate program she'd talked herself into and then out of loving, short on rent 1 month in the city, and she called me sounding embarrassed in a way that broke something open in my chest. I sent $400 without a second thought, and when she thanked me, relieved and a little tearful on the phone, I felt something I hadn't felt in years: useful. Necessary. Like the mother I'd always been afraid I wasn't quite enough of, back when her father was still around to be the more exciting parent. I want to be honest with you, that feeling, more than the money itself, is what I think I was really giving myself permission to keep. The requests never stopped after that. They just got quieter about announcing themselves, the way water finds its way under a door without you ever hearing it arrive. A car repair. A security deposit. Just this once that became, if I'm honest with the calendar rather than my memory, something closer to once a month, and then, in the years after she married a decent, hard-working, slightly bewildered man named Marcus Cole, something closer to whenever it suited her. I never said no. I want you to understand the shape of that never, because it is the whole engine of this story, in 9 years, across what I would later calculate, with a steadiness that frightened me, to be just over $61,000, I did not once ask my daughter a direct question about what the money was actually for. The routine settled into something almost domestic. She would call, not text. She always preferred calling for money, texting for everything else, and it took me embarrassingly long to notice that pattern meant something. I would ask how she was, we'd talk about her job, about Marcus, about nothing much, and somewhere in the last 2 minutes of the call, almost as an afterthought, she'd mention that things were a little tight, and I would already be reaching for my laptop before she finished the sentence. I told myself this was simply what a mother did. I told myself Peter had never needed this kind of help because Peter had never needed anything, that some children are just built sturdier than others, and that Nadia's need for rescuing wasn't a flaw in her. It was a debt I owed her for a father who'd left and a mother who, in the early years after he did, had been too tired and too frightened to be as steady as she deserved. My sister Dolores was the first person who said anything to my face about it. We were at her kitchen table, going through old photographs, and my phone did its double chime, and I excused myself the way I always did, and when I came back Dolores looked at me for a long moment before saying, carefully, "Fran, Does Nadia know you're still paying off your own roof? I laughed it off. I told her it wasn't like that, it was occasional, it was family looking after family. Dolores didn't push. She just said, "You've always been the one who can't stand to watch anyone hurt, even when the hurting's mostly finished," and went back to the photographs, and I thought about that sentence for weeks afterward without ever quite letting myself follow it all the way to its end. Peter asked me once, more directly, over Sunday coffee, whether Nadia was doing all right financially, because he'd noticed, his word, noticed, said carefully, like he was stepping around something breakable, that she and Marcus seemed to be taking trips he couldn't quite square with what he understood their income to be. I told him I didn't know anything about that. That was true, technically. I had simply never asked the question that would have made it untrue. In private, in the quiet after those calls, I built myself elaborate, comforting theories about what was actually happening. I told myself Marcus's construction business was inconsistent, seasonal, that self-employment income was unpredictable in ways a pension and a paid-off mortgage made it easy for me to forget. I told myself Nadia was proud, that admitting real trouble would cost her something I didn't want to make her pay, so I never made her explain herself, because explaining, I believed, would have humiliated her, and I would rather empty my savings account quietly than ask my own daughter to account for herself out loud. I was never fully certain that was the whole truth even while I was telling it to myself. I don't think I let myself be certain of much of anything, on purpose, for a very long time. The reason I never once said no was not complicated, and I don't think it makes me a fool, though I understand if it sounds that way from the outside. I had grown up with a mother who counted every dollar out loud, who made asking for anything feel like a small, permanent debt to your own dignity, and I had promised myself, standing at her funeral at 19, that I would never make my own children feel that particular kind of smallness. That promise, more than love alone, is what kept my hand moving toward my phone every time it made that sound. There was one night, Nadia was maybe 28, when she called needing money for what she said was a medical bill, and something in her voice was off enough that I almost asked a real question, the beginning of one forming in my mouth, and then I heard myself say instead, "How much do you need?" And I have thought about that swallowed question more times than almost any other moment in this whole story. That was the closest I ever came, in 9 years, to testing the boundary I never let myself set. Things changed shape gradually, the way weather does before a rail storm arrives. I retired at 60, which cut my income by more than a third and turned every transfer from a convenience into an actual sacrifice, something taken from a fixed and shrinking pool rather than a flexible one. I told no one this, including Nadia. Around the same time, her requests grew larger and, though I didn't want to admit the pattern even to myself, more frequent, no longer the occasional $400 but, twice, sums closer to $3,000, always with a reason attached that sounded plausible enough in the moment and grew thinner every time I turned it over afterward in the dark. I started keeping a private list, just for myself, in the back of an old recipe notebook, not to confront her with it, not yet, but because some quiet, self-protective part of me had begun to understand that I needed a record of what I was doing to my own future, even if I wasn't ready to look at it directly. The evening everything actually changed started ordinarily enough. Nadia called asking for $2,200, urgently, for what she described as a plumbing emergency at their house, a burst pipe, a flooded basement, a contractor who needed a deposit that same night. I was already reaching for my laptop, the way I always did, when Marcus's mother, Carol, a warm, blunt woman I'd become genuinely fond of over the years, happened to call me not 20 minutes later about an unrelated matter, a birthday gift for one of the grandchildren, and mentioned, entirely in passing, how relieved she was that the new kitchen renovation at Nadia and Marcus's house was finally finished. No more strangers in and out of the house every day, she said, laughing. What a mess it had been. I sat very still for a moment after we hung up. There had been no burst pipe. There had been no flooded basement. There had, apparently, been a kitchen renovation I knew nothing about, paid for by money that had not, as far as I could tell from anything Carol said, come from an emergency fund built on my transfers. I did not confront Nadia that night. I want to be honest about that, Because I think it matters, I did not call her back in anger, I did not send an accusing text, I simply sat at my kitchen table with the recipe notebook open in front of me, adding up 9 years of numbers I had never let myself add up in one sitting, until I reached a total that made my hands go cold. $61,400. I sat with that number for a long time before I did anything else. The conversation itself happened 4 days later, at my kitchen table, because I asked her to come over to talk, and something in my voice must have told her this wasn't going to be an ordinary Sunday visit, because she came alone, without Marcus, and sat down across from me looking braced for something before I'd said a single word. I told her about Carol's phone call. I watched her face do several things in quick succession, surprise, then something closer to calculation, then, finally, something that looked almost like relief, as though a weight she'd been carrying alone had finally been set down between us instead. It wasn't a lie, exactly, she said, and then stopped, and then said, more honestly, it was easier to ask for an emergency than to ask for help with something I felt stupid about. We overspent on the kitchen. Marcus and I have been bad with money for a long time, Mom, and it was easier to let you think it was bad luck than to admit it was bad choices. I asked her, as plainly as I have ever asked her anything, why she had never simply told me the truth. She looked at me for a long moment before she answered. Because you never once asked, she said. You just paid. I think some part of me needed you to keep doing that, and some part of me hated myself every time you did. I did not raise my voice. I want you to understand that this story does not end in a shouting match, because that isn't what actually happened, and it isn't the truth I want to leave you with. What I told her, as steadily as I could manage, was that I loved her exactly as much as I had loved her every single day for 36 years, and that none of what I was about to say came from anywhere but that love. I told her the money was finished, not out of punishment, but because I had, somewhere in the last 9 years, quietly spent down a retirement I would need for myself, in service of a habit neither of us had ever had the courage to examine honestly. And then I told her the one rule, the only rule, that I intended to keep from that day forward. I would help her again, if help was ever truly needed, but only after she told me the whole, plain truth of what the money was for, out loud, before a single dollar moved. No more urgent calls answered in a reflex. No more chime, and my hand already moving. If she needed to ask, she could ask, but she would have to actually ask the real question, not a story built to spare either of us the discomfort of an honest one. She cried at the table, and I let her, without moving to fix it the way I always had before, because I understood, finally, that fixing it was the very habit that had gotten us here. So that's it, she said eventually, you're just done. I told her that wasn't what I'd said. I told her I was done being an ATM she didn't have to look in the eye, and that I very much hoped to still be her mother, which was a different, harder, and to my mind far more valuable thing to be. I revisited that recipe notebook one more time before I closed this chapter, going back through 9 years of small, quiet lies I'd told myself right alongside the ones she'd told me, the plumbing emergency that became a kitchen I'd never seen, the just this once that had become a decade, the swallowed question from the night of the medical bill that I now suspect, though I will never know for certain, was never entirely true either. I don't say that to punish her in the retelling. I say it because I think I owe you, and myself, the same honesty I finally asked of her. 6 months on, the shape of things between us has changed, though not, I think, in the direction either of us expected at that kitchen table. Nadia called 2 months ago, genuinely frightened this time, about a real medical bill for Marcus, and instead of reaching for my laptop, I asked her to tell me everything, the number, the reason, the plan for paying whatever portion she could manage herself. And she did, plainly, without flinching, and I helped her, because that is still who I am and still what love looks like when it's honest rather than reflexive. The difference now is that I know what I'm giving, and why, and so does she. That's the whole of the rule. It turned out to be a very small thing to change, and it has made an enormous difference to both of us. I think, in the end, the hardest lesson in all of this was learning that love and rescue are not the same instinct, even though they can feel, from the inside, exactly alike for years at a time. I gave my daughter money for 9 years because I couldn't stand to watch her hurt, and it took me all of that time to understand that some of what I was calling her hurting was actually just her asking, in the only language either of us had let ourselves learn, for a mother who would finally ask her a real question instead of simply making the discomfort disappear. If this story stayed with you, join our community by hitting that like button and subscribing for more quiet, honest stories.